Welcome to an RPG in a Box video tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a further look at the topic of using the script editor as an alternative to the dialogue editor. Now, I've covered this topic before in my dialogue editor course. I'll leave a link to the relevant video in the YouTube video description. But I want to cover some things in this video which I didn't get round to doing in that particular video. So this is going to be a sort of top 5 tips for things you should know if you are going to use the script editor as a alternative to the dialogue editor. So I've talked about before why you might choose to do that. The main reason being the dialogue editor in its current implementation is a bit limiting in the sense that it's not flexible enough for you to be able to move nodes around and add things and remove things at will. Anyone who's used a dialogue editor for any significant amount of time will be able to attest to the problems that it has. I'm hoping that it will be improved as RPG in a Box gets further developed, but until that happens, it's a bit of a clunky tool to use. So I would personally advocate, once you get more familiar with scripting, to just write your dialogues in the script editor, because you can move things around, you can put things in different places, you can add things, insert things, you can remove things very easily without having to remake your whole dialogue. The problem with the dialogue editor is if you're going to seriously use it, you have to know 100% how your dialogue is structured before you even start. And you can't make any mistakes when building it, because if you forget a few nodes, overlook something, and then you realize, oh no, I've missed this node, I need to add it in, you might not be able to. And then you've got to start all over again. That's what I mean by it's a bit clunky. So I definitely advocate using the script editor. So if that's something that you think you want to do, you want to use the script editor, then this video should be useful for you, because it's going to go over all the things you need to know if you choose to do that. So let's start with tip number 1. So I've already covered this in great detail before, both in the video, which is linked in the YouTube video description, but I also made a forum thread on the main official forum, specifically talking about this very topic. So if you want to get further study on this topic, then look in the YouTube video description. I will, of course, cover them briefly in this video, just so that this is a one-stop place for all this information. So this tip is all about where in the script editor are the alternatives for all the dialogue nodes. Okay, so to demonstrate this, let's load a dialogue up. Let's just delete this node. This is an example dialogue, which I have currently set on Sarah. So let's just quickly go over all of let's get rid of that. Let's go through all of these nodes. This is what you see when you load the dialogue editor up. So I'm going to show you where all of these are, with the exception of GoTo. We'll come back to that. But I'm going to show you where all of these are in the script editor. Okay, starting with the NPC node. We'll do top to bottom. So the NPC node, this is obviously the node that covers what NPCs say to you. There's 2 types of settings you can have for this. You can have initiating NPC, as it says here. This is the NPC who starts the dialogue. So whichever NPC you put this dialogue file onto, that NPC is going to be the one that says this. So if I put this dialogue file example onto Stumpy, Stumpy will be the one that says this. If I then put the same dialogue file on Sarah, Sarah will say this, as long as this is set to initiating NPC. Alternatively, you could drop this down and you could select entity ID, and then you could type in a specific entity's ID, like Sarah1, for example, into there. And now, regardless of which NPC you put this dialogue file onto, this node will always be said by this NPC, as long as it's a valid existing entity. So to do those in the script editor, we'll create a new quick test script. I'll call this example. And the node you want for this is a display message node, and it's the one that you get by default anyway when you start a new script. So it's quite handy that it is the relevant node to begin with. So this will be the text that your NPC says, and then to make this a NPC node, you simply set the speaker entity from none, which would make it then just a generic display message, to character. Okay, and then when you click this expression builder icon, you can choose self, which is the initiating NPC. So if you want to use the initiating NPC behavior, where it doesn't matter who you talk to, it will automatically be that NPC. Make sure you select self as the speaker. Okay. Otherwise, you can do entity by ID. And then if I type Sarah1 into here, that would be the same thing as saying specifically Sarah says this. Okay. So it doesn't matter who you put this dialogue onto, only Sarah will say this bit of text. Okay. So that's how you do an NPC node in the script editor. Okay. It's a display message with the speaker set to character and set to either self or entity by ID. Next, we have player node. Not much to set here. It is the player node. It's what the player says. So to simply do that in the script editor, it's the same node, display message, but you just change the speaker entity to player. It's as simple as that. And now this is a player node. Now, player nodes in the dialogue editor can also be split into choices. We'll come back to those because in order to deal with these in the script editor, it makes sense to have covered some other nodes first. So we'll come back to player choices, but just be aware, I'm going to come back to them. They will be covered. Next, we have message. This is just your generic display message. It's just in a dialogue, it would just be a message, a bit of text that's not tied to either the player or the NPC. It would just be sort of world building text or descriptive text or whatever. To do that in the script editor, it's just simple as turning the speaker entity off to say none. And then here's your standard display message. So whatever text you type in here will be generic world building descriptive text. Okay. So that's covered how to do all of the main, what I would call dialogue nodes. You've got your NPC node, your player node, and your message. They're all done with this same node here, display message. So it's super efficient in the script editor because the one node can do all of it. So in other words, you can work very quickly because if this is an NPC node, for example, we'll set this to self, you can then right-click and duplicate this and then just set this to player. And you've just made an NPC node and a player node very quickly. And then you can duplicate this. There's your second NPC node if it's the same NPC that responds, etc., and you just wire these up. And then obviously the benefit, as I say, to the script editor over the dialogue editor is if I want to move these around, like for example, I want this to speak before this one, I can just disconnect these and move these around. You can't do that in the dialogue editor. The dialogue editor is a much more linearly focused, top-down process. And if you don't have something in place when you start building below, sometimes you can't go back and change things. But here you can. Okay, so that's already covered the main dialogue nodes. Now we have condition. Condition nodes in the dialogue editor are used for checking if a variable is set or if a value is a state is set as something, and if so, do one thing, and if not, do another. So in this case, it comes by default with this property here that checks, have you spoken to them before? So have you spoken to this NPC before? If you have, then you'll go down the then path. So you would put dialogue nodes into here. And if you haven't spoken to them, then you'll go down the else path, right? So how do you do that in the script editor? It's essentially the same node, but it's just called slightly different. It's called evaluate condition. Drag that in, and then to recreate, obviously you can set this condition to be anything you want, but to recreate this one, for example, you would just go into the expression builder, you would say self property equals Boolean, and then you change the name of this up here to visited, and that would create the same condition. Okay. And then here is your then path. And this is your else path. And then one thing that the script editor can do that the dialogue editor cannot is we can also do an end path. You cannot do that in the dialogue editor. Notice how now I've added a condition. If I close these for a moment, I can't place a node outside. I have to either go into the then or the else. I can't put this node, this NPC node, outside this condition now. Whereas in the script editor, if I want to put something outside this condition, I can. I can type display message, drag this in, make sure that comes out of the end, and this is now happening underneath, outside the condition. So you can have dialogue that only plays if certain conditions are met, but then you can also have dialogue afterwards that always plays. You can't seem to do that in the dialogue editor. So there probably is a way, but you have to work around it. You probably have to add another section and stuff like that. It just gets a bit more, clunky. You have to work around it. Whereas in the dialogue editor, script editor, you can just do it. Just place it underneath, outside your condition, and you're away. So this is your then path. So any dialogue that should play, if this is true, gets connected to this dot, goes off down there. And anything that's not, if that's not true, connect things to the else path, and those things will play in that case. Okay, so that's how to do condition nodes in the script editor. Very simple. Next, we have script nodes. Now, there's no node in the script editor to show you this because the whole thing is a script editor. The whole point of script nodes is because you're writing a dialogue, it means you can have some script execute in your dialogue. So you'd use a script node during your dialogue, and then you'd write in the script node your script, your code that you want to have happen. For example, changing a property, or spawning an enemy, or changing someone's health, or whatever, changing money, or whatever, giving an item, right? In the script editor, you don't need to add a node for that. You're already in the script editor. So for example, we could have a display message where an NPC says something, and then let's say they give us an item. Well, you would just find the function for that, give item, for example, and you just add it in next. So it's the next thing that happens in your dialogue sequence. You don't need a script node because you're writing it in the script editor, right? So that's the advantage to the script editor as well, is you don't need a separate node just to do code. You're already writing the whole thing as code anyway. So then the next node after your dialogue will be the thing you want to have happen, or the series of things that you want to have happen. Okay, it will just be part of that path in your dialogue. Okay, so that's the script editor, plain and simply. That's the script node, sorry, plain and simply. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to skip the go-to node for a second because there's no such node for that in the script editor. It's more of a process, and there's two ways that you can do a go-to node process in the script editor. That will be one of the tips that we get to in this video, so I'm going to come back to that. But the last thing to talk about quickly is comment. Comment, I can imagine, is very rarely used, but no, I very rarely use it, but maybe there are people out there that are using it, so I'll mention it. These are used just to leave yourself notes while you're building the dialogue. Your players will never see this. It's not part of the dialogue that's actually played in the game. So you would leave yourself notes, for example, I must remember to finish this path, or I must remember to add this choice, or whatever. So that's what the comment node is for. To do comments in the script editor, it's not a node, it's done in the text section. So you need to click edit down here, maybe even expand this up so you can see more of it. To do comments in the script editor, you just go to a new line, either above or below, and then just type 2 forward slashes and it will go gray. And then your text here is a comment. So if you want to type something like, I must remember to add something, or please don't forget to change this, or whatever the note is you're leaving to yourself, right? It's to remind you to do something later, or just to keep yourself aware of something, that kind of thing. Or explaining, which bit of your dialogue is which path. And so, comments can be very useful, but this is how you do it in the dialogue, in the script editor, sorry. Now, before we move on, something very important you need to know about comments when it comes to using them in the script editor. They only work, let me just type something, test. They only work in the code view, the box-like code view. If I click apply and save, that saves the script. If we drop this down, notice you don't see them in the Visual Script Editor. Comments aren't something you see in the Visual Script Editor. That's because they're not really used. Now, you need to be very careful with that, because if I decide now to add a node via the Visual Script Editor, like for example, fail quest, I'll just drag this in, it deletes my comment. Because what happens when you drag something into the Visual Script Editor is it updates the code. It refreshes the code so it can add this node in and sync it up to everything that's there already. And in doing so, it completely rewrites the text code based on what it sees in the window. And so because comments aren't recognized by the visual script, they don't get restored when a visual script updates the text script. So if you're going to use comments, you have to stick to writing your code in the text view because you'll lose them otherwise, okay? So as long as you don't ever drag nodes in from the visual script editor, you won't lose them, okay? So for example, if I leave myself another comment, and then I drag in a function like fail quest into here, and then I apply and save, I don't lose it, okay? And I can still open this up and see my visual script, but you should just not build with it if you're going to leave yourself comments, because the moment you either delete a node, basically anything that updates this and therefore this, you will lose your comments. So deleting this would also count, and it's gone, right? So just be mindful of that. If you're going to use comments in your dialog scripts, use the text. I prefer to use the text editor anyway, but those of you who like to use the dialog builder might choose to build your dialogues visually in the script editor as well. So if you do that, you probably can't use comments. It's probably not a good idea because you won't be able to save them, okay? So I'll just point that out. So now let's get to player choices. We'll come back to these. The reason why I wanted to come back to them is because the way they work in the script editor is they also use the evaluate condition. Okay, so I wanted to cover that first. So player choices. These are actually done with two nodes. Let me show you what I mean. So you have an NPC node or a message node, whatever you want. So you would have, please help. That would be your NPC request. And then you'd have your player response, and there's two possible or maybe three possible choices. Okay. Or too busy, whatever you want to write, right? So these are your player responses to this request. So in the dialog editor, it's two separate nodes. However, in game, they'll be treated as the same message panel. I'll show you what I mean. So here we are in game. So if I click on Sarah, you get Sarah saying, please help. And then my two choices are in the same panel with the two choices underneath. Even though they are two separate nodes in the game, they're treated as this is the top bit of the panel, and then these choices come underneath, okay? So they're separate in the dialog editor, but they're together in game. The nice thing about the script editor is that process is clearly showed because you use display choices. So you use an entirely different node for player choices. You use this node, and it's all in one node. This is the NPC node that's above. So this would say, please help. Here are your choices. So this would be okay, too busy. And then if you wanted a third choice, a fourth, you could add them. You can just keep typing speech marks underneath and adding choices into them. Or you can delete choice 3 and say, I only want 2 choices. Okay, so those are your player choices, the text for your choices. And then because you want this to be an NPC node, if you do, it doesn't have to be an NPC node, because bearing in mind, it's just the node you put above. You could have put a message above. You could have done that and then that, right? So it doesn't have to be an NPC node, but if it is an NPC node, you have a character, and you would either use self if it's the initiating NPC, or the entity by ID, which we covered earlier, right? And if it's just a simple message, maybe you're interacting with a computer or something, then you can say none, right? $result is where your choice gets stored. So whether you click OK or too busy or choice 1, choice 2, whichever one you click on, that will get stored into this variable. Now, dollar variables are what are called local variables. So this result variable is local only to this script. So if only this dialog can use this choice, then leave it as a dollar variable. You can call it whatever you want. So I could call this choice, for example. Okay. However, if you want to store the player's choice more globally and have other scripts and other aspects of your game know which choice you made, then use a global property. So you would type global.property, open and close square brackets, open speech marks, and then you'd give your property a name. Let's just call this choice for a moment. You'd obviously call it something a bit more relevant than that. There you go, global property choice equals, and then the result of your choice, whichever one of these you choose, goes into this property, okay? And then you can query this property in other scripts or other bits of dialogue to see what it is, and therefore know the choice that was made. This data is, because it's an array, it returns a numerical value. So don't query if it's actually choice 1 or choice 2. What you actually do, let's put this back to $, choice. The way it works is you then use an evaluate condition. You then have your evaluate condition underneath, and you need to query if variable equals and then number, okay? Now here you need to type the same name, so in this case choice, and then choices always start with 0, so start by checking 0 first. So if choice is 0, if it's 0, it means you clicked the first one, okay? And then underneath here you would have what dialogue nodes should play in that case. So if we have a display message, link it up to the then node rather than the else node, like so. That would be what happens if you clicked that one. If you click that one, then you would either wire it up to the else, or if you had more than one choice, you would have an add condition, and you would specify variable equals number, and you'd specify the other number. So you would say choice equals 1. So you've got an else if choice equals 1, and then you'd have another message that gets wired up to that. I don't know if I can, yeah, anyway. And then else will be everything else that's not either of those. Right? But that's how you use the display choices, okay? And that's how you do player choices in the script editor. Okay, so the next tip is how to do go-to nodes, because as I said, there isn't a specific node I can show you in the Visual Script Editor. It's more a process, and there's 2 ways you can do it. So I'm going to show you both, and you can choose the one that you prefer that suits your needs, okay? So for this, we're not going to use the Visual Script Editor. I'm actually going to use the main text. I prefer to type my dialogues. I just find it easier to free flow that way. But here I have a part of my dialogue where I want to I would typically use a go-to node, and that's why I've commented it in there just so you can see where it's going to go. So the point of this go-to node is I want this NPC to say this bit of text here and then to replay this choice, so that if the player comes back to this NPC later, having chosen not to help, that if they change their mind, they can come back. So if they come back, they say, oh, good, you've returned, and then they can choose this again. Would you be willing to help? And then you get the choice again. But rather than copy this text and paste it in here and literally repeat this code, I want it to act as a go-to node and jump down to this bit of text here and just play this again, right? So that's what a go-to node does in the dialogue editor. So how do you do that in the script editor? So there's 2 ways. The first way is to take this bit of code, and both ways require you to take the code, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to take this bit of code, and I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to scroll up to the top of the dialogue script, give myself some space, and I'm going to type function, and then I'm going to give my function a name that's relevant to this dialogue. So I'm just going to call this Sarah choice, open and close brackets, and then type begin, and then do 2 lines, end semicolon. And then between the 2 lines, I'm going to press tab, and I'm going to paste, in fact, I might just paste my code, okay? So in my function, I now have the choice, okay? And I've taken it out of the main dialogue, okay? What this now means is whenever I want to go to this bit of dialogue, I don't actually have it in the dialog itself. I've taken it out, but I call that function. So in this case, Sarah choice, like that. And then whenever this script hits this, it's going to see this and do this. So it's going to act like a go-to node. It's going to be like, well, what's this? Oh, you mentioned that earlier. It's all of this. So we'll do all of that down here. And I can also reuse it down here too. So now I've got this bit of code here happening twice in my script without having to actually retype that code twice. I do it once above and then just call it whenever I want. So one pro and one con for this method. The pro is that it's kept in the same file. I've been able to put this code in, I've kept it in this same document, this script file. I've just put it at the top and I've given it a function name. Great. The con that you need to be aware of, however, is that functions are a self-contained bubble, even inside the script. So this script here has this code here, but the function, even though it's in the same document, is its own locked-in, walled-off mini universe, if you will, which basically means that we cannot use self. Self will get lost. The connection between the initiating NPC and this bit of code gets lost, because although this script, when it's put on the NPC and is triggered, knows what self is, the function, because it's its own bubble, gets disconnected, so self gets lost. So two ways to deal with that. One is not ideal, but it might work in your circumstance, is to specify the entity by ID. So instead of self, you would type entity, open and close square brackets, and then pass in their ID, Sarah1. Okay, that's great, but only if this dialogue can only be said by that specific NPC. If you intend for this dialogue to be used on many NPCs that have different characters, then clearly we can't use that approach because we don't want Sarah to say this if it's not Sarah that's saying it, all right? So we need something a bit more dynamic like self, but we don't have access to self. So how do we do it? So to do that, you need to add a parameter between the brackets of your function name. So in this case, Sarah choice, I'm going to type $speaker, okay? And then wherever you have self in your script that's in the function, change it to $speaker. So everywhere that says self, so this needs to be $speaker. I know I've typed that wrong, but you get the idea. I'm just showing you. This needs to be $speaker. I'm just to leave typos in now because I'm not actually going to run this code. This needs to be $speaker. Right, you get the idea, okay? It's because I'm leaning over my keyboard. Right, so that's the point, right? You need to use this variable all the time throughout your function. You don't have to do it in the dialogue, but in your function, you need to have this name used whenever the NPC is mentioned, okay? Or whenever the NPC is referenced. And then when it comes to your calling of this function in your actual dialogue, you have to then pass in self. Okay, so because your dialogue file has self as a relevant reference, it will get passed into this function as speaker. So then this function will know who self is, but it will know it as speaker rather than self, but it will be passed in from the dialogue when it's called, because you're saying self should become speaker, and then speaker uses it, right? So that's the way to keep it dynamic, but you just have to know that you have to do this, because otherwise if you leave this as an empty function, you can't use self because it will lose the connection, okay? So that's one way that you can do goto nodes, is to put it as a function separate at the top of your dialogue and then call it that way. I'm going to undo this now, put it back to self. The other way is to take this code and cut it, delete the function. Oops. Take these out. apply and save, and then create a new script file. Let's call it Sarah1 dialog 2. Edit the text and paste your code that you've just cut into a separate script, and then apply and save. And this way you can still use self, because what we're about to do will still use self. So then whenever you want to reference that dialog in your go-to node, instead of using the function, you would just say execute script and then pass in Sarah1 dialog 2. And you would repeat that whenever you want to use that bit of dialogue. So down here as well. So what will happen is it will do all of this, and then it will, separately to this, it will then trigger this script and do all of this. And so because it's a separate script being triggered in different places, again, it means you don't have to duplicate the code. You just have it once, and it will play out whenever you want to use it by just using execute script. One benefit potentially, there's two potential benefits to using execute script over the function, and one con. So the benefits are that, first of all, you can use self. Notice how I haven't changed self. It will still reference self. Because this script is being executed at the same time as this script, self is still relevant. It will pass automatically self through to the executed script for you, so you don't need to change your code. The other benefit is execute script can be set to run either simultaneously or take priority. So what I mean by that is if I add true as a parameter, that means this script, the one that's triggered it, will pause until all of the code that's inside this file, i.e. all of this, gets triggered first. When this script finishes, it's done all of its stuff, then this script will continue on and do the rest of its code. So for example, if I have a message here, this message is not going to play until this entire script file has finished, because we said true for pause. So when this script triggers, this one will pause until this one finishes doing all of its stuff that's inside its file, and then this message will show. If we take true off, this script and this message will play at the same time. Okay, so you have a bit more flexibility with execute script if you want things to happen first before the rest of your dialogue continues, or if dialogue should be happening at the same time as something else that's happening in your main script. Whereas functions can only either pause or continue simultaneously. I think it's pause, but I can't remember which one of the two it is. But you can only have, there's only one way it works. You can't set it to the other. The con, those are the two pros, is that you can still use self and you can potentially pause your script or unpause it depending on what you want to do. The con, obviously, is it makes your dialogues require more files. So it's up to you which one you use. I show them to you. That's how you do two ways you do go-to nodes in the script editor. Tip number 3 is subfolders. So I haven't done a video on subfolders before, so this will be the first time I'm covering it. So if you're interested in how to do subfolders, know that you can. I should point out, though, that the only asset that it doesn't work for is maps. So don't create subfolders for your maps, because they won't work. Your game won't work if you do that. However, tiles, objects, characters, dialogue, scripts, they can all have subfolders, music, etc. All the assets can have subfolders, but you just need to be aware how to make them and also how to use them. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover in this tip. So the reason why I'm covering subfolders in this video is because if you're going to script dialogues, it's probably a good idea to put them into a folder separate from your main code of your game, just because you want to differentiate your dialogues from your code. So just to organize things a bit better. And you might also want to further organize them based on the NPC whose dialogue it is, right? Because you might have multiple dialogue files, for example, if you're using the execute script go-to method. right? You might have multiple script files per NPC. So how do you make subfolders? Well, currently, you cannot make them within RPG in a Box. It's something you have to do outside RPG in a Box in your operating system, whether it be Windows, Mac, Linux, whatever, right? But I'll show you how to quickly do it. So within RPG in a Box, go to your scripts folder in the Game Explorer panel, right-click, and click Open Folder Location. That will bring up your operating system's file explorer, and you'll be inside the scripts folder. Now, I don't like this particular interface, so I'm going to switch to the file explorer version. Here I am in the same folder that you would see pop up if you did what I did, which is right-click on scripts and do Open Folder Location. When you're in your folder, scripts folder, you should see all your scripts. You want to right-click and create a new folder. Call it whatever you want. Makes sense for me to call it dialogues. And then within that, I'm going to create another one for my NPC called Sarah1, which is her ID, so it makes sense to use it. And then you just basically go back into your scripts folder, find all the scripts that are relevant to that dialogue. So in my case, Sarah1. So I find all of the files that have that name. So that's that one all the way to that one, because these are two dialogue files. We've got Sarah1 dialogue and Sarah1 dialogue 2. Cut those, go into my dialogues folder, go into my Sarah1 folder, and then paste. And there you go. So that takes them out of this main folder and puts them in a dialogues Sarah1 folder. Okay. Quit that, close your file explorer, back to RPG in a Box. Now, when you go back to RPG in a Box, you'll see nothing's changed. Not only are there no subfolders, but your two script files are still in the scripts folder. In order to see the change, you need to reopen your project. So you can either quit RPG in a Box, but you can also just exit the game manager and then reopen your project. And it will rescan the folders and everything. And now if I go to scripts, there's my dialogues folder. Open that up, there's my Sarah1 folder. And open up, and there's my two scripts inside. Okay. Now, the negative at the moment to this approach, it's not a huge thing, but it's just something you need to be aware of, and it's a bit annoying. But it's just because folders aren't built into the system yet. Is if you want to add a script, want to make a script, you cannot currently build them into a subfolder. So, for example, if I select Sarah, one folder, and I right-click and create a new script, it's not going to create this script in that subfolder. I'll just call this Boo, for example. Click OK. It's created it outside. Notice it's not in the dialogues folder. It's not in the Sarah1 folder. It's outside. It's in the main scripts folder. And I can't move it. I can't drag it into there. So in order to put Boo into dialogues, I'd then have to do what I did a second ago. I'd have to right-click, open folder location, go grab Boo and put it using the file explorer into the folder, and then restart RPG in a Box, or reload the project, and then it would appear. Okay, so just know that it's a bit clunky at the moment to use subfolders, but they do work. They can be done, but you have to do it outside RPG in a Box. So get all your folders set up outside first before you load RPG in a Box, and then use them. Okay. Once you've set up your subfolders, you then need to know that you need to obviously type in the full path. So, for example, going back to our dialogue script, Sarah1 dialogue, where's that? That's here. Here we have our execute script, Sarah1 dialogue 2. This isn't going to work anymore because this script file has been moved into a subfolder. So in order to do that, we now have to type dialogues Sarah1. Like that. You have to type the full path. You have to add, because this file here is expected to be inside the main scripts folder, which is why it's just Sarah1 dialogue 2. But you've put it inside a dialogues folder inside here, and then inside here you've put a Sarah1 folder, and then you've put the script inside there. So when you reference this, you've got to reference the subfolder, and then the subfolder in that, and then the file name, which is what we're doing here with a /. Okay. And so I'd have to do the same thing up here, or I could just copy and paste. Yeah. So that's how to use subfolders. And as I say, you can do the same process for tiles, objects, characters, dialogues, scripts, images, music. The only thing you can't use it for is maps. Maps cannot be put into subfolders. They need to be kept in the maps folder. Okay. But, if you wanted to make a tile subfolder, you would just open folder location and create the folders in File Explorer and then move the assets, the models into those subfolders. Okay. I will cover subfolders probably in a separate video at another time, just so that people have a specific place where it's talked about for all the different assets. But for now, I just wanted to cover them because it's relevant as a good tip for writing dialogues in the script editor. The reason for this tip is because we've now written our dialogue in the script editor, as opposed to the dialogue editor, we need to change what we've assigned to the NPC. So in this case, I've got Sarah on the map, and she's got this speech bubble icon above her head. And the reason for that is because currently she's set to, when player interacts, start dialogue, and then the dialogue file. But that's only relevant if you write the dialogue in the dialogue editor. But if you've written your dialogue as a script, then in the map editor, you want to change this to run script, because it's a script, right? It's not a dialogue. And then you would point this to your dialogues subfolder, and then the dialogue that Sarah should have, or this NPC should have, okay? Now, the issue that you're going to find when you do that is obviously we get this script icon above her head instead of the dialogue icon. Now, what that means in game is we're going to get a different cursor icon. I should also point out that this tip I'm talking about now is really only relevant for grid-based games, because free movement doesn't use the cursors anyway. You would use the E interact key when you get closer to Sarah. But in the grid mode game, notice how when I mouse over Sarah, we get a hand pointer icon or cursor instead of a speech bubble. And that's because the game's recognizing this as a script that's on Sarah, not a dialogue. So that might be fine. If you're happy to keep using the hand icon, we can click on Sarah and it will run the script. And because it's a dialogue, it will play the dialogue. So functionally, it will work. But visually, you might want the player to know it's dialogue rather than a script. So how do we restore the speech bubble, even though we're not actually using dialogue? Well, we can't actually restore the inbuilt one because it's hard-coded to only show that cursor when you're using the run dialogue or start dialogue option. But we can build our own. So in this tip, I'm going to show you how to make your own custom cursors. So firstly, you need a custom cursor image. Now, there's two ways you can do that. You can either use the RPG in a Box editor, which I'll show you how to access in a minute, or you can just use any image editing software like Photoshop, GIMP, Paint, whatever you want to use, right? And then make the image first and then bring it into your images folder in your Game Explorer. Again, you do that outside RPG in a Box using your File Explorer. Or if you want to keep it in-house, what you do is you go to the items editor. It's a bit of a roundabout way of doing this. I would like Justin to add the ability to access this editor more globally. But right now, the only way to access the editor is to go to the items editor. And then you click this button here and create an image that's either 16 by 16 or 32 by 32. Give your file a name. Click OK, and it brings up the image editor. And then from here, you can draw your cursors and images and things like that. And then you click OK to save it. I'm going to obviously not save that, right? Once you've done that, you will then have a image that you can then use as a cursor. So what I've done ahead of time is if you go to the game configuration section, we have this speak cursor, which is the built-in cursor image. Go to custom cursors and click add. Give it a name. I'll just call it speak. I might not be able to use that because obviously predefined one. So I'll call this speak 2. And then I've created one called dialogue, which you can see is almost identical. I've created this in the item image editor. Okay. And obviously you would drop this down and select your relevant image, in my case, dialog.png. Then you click Show Edit Hotspot. That will show this flashing pixel. This is where your mouse must be when you click in order to register a click. So we should probably click somewhere on the actual speech bubble so that it makes sense for the speech bubble to be the thing that's over the NPC, rather than having it off to the side of the NPC when we click in order for it to register. Then click OK. So we've now saved a custom cursor, which we've created in the image editor or an image editor of your choice, and you've imported into RPG in a Box. You set that as your custom cursor, set your hotspot, click OK, and then the last thing you need to do is in the map editor, click your NPC that should use it, and scroll up to interaction cursor, and instead of use predefined, set this to speak to. And now, even though she's got a script on her, if we go into game, now that we're in game, when we hover over Sarah, the run script icon or cursor is now my custom speech cursor. So now it looks like it makes sense for what's about to happen. If I click on Sarah, we get dialogue, right? Technically, we're not. We're running a script, but we've put a custom cursor on Sarah that makes our script running cursor, the interaction cursor, look more like a speech bubble, okay? It should be pointed out that this is per NPC. So just because I've set Sarah's cursor to this doesn't mean that every NPC's cursor is going to be this. If you wanted it to be more global, then you would have to do that by changing the predefined interact cursor. You would say, don't use the pre-built one, set it to that. And that would mean every person you have a script on would have this speech bubble icon. But because I only want Sarah to have scripted dialogue, I will keep that as it is and put this specifically on Sarah. And you would put this on any NPCs that have scripted dialogue on them, okay? So that's how to make custom cursors and use them in RPG in a Box. The next tip is something you need to be aware of when using scripted dialogues as opposed to dialogue editor dialogues. When you use dialogue editor dialogues, so for example, here's one I made earlier. If I was to put this dialogue file on Sarah as a start dialogue rather than a script, when you talk to Sarah in game, if she's set to roam around, i.e. have a behavior that means she wanders around, when you start dialogue, she will pause and stand in place while you go through the whole of the dialogue file. With a scripted dialogue, that behavior does not happen by default. So if we have Sarah running around, walking around, and then we have run script on Sarah, and we run that script, we go up to her and we click on her, and our script triggers this dialogue, she will still walk around even though we're navigating this dialogue, okay? So obviously we don't want Sarah to walk around, okay? So the point I'm making first is that by default, the dialogue editor will pause NPCs in place while you talk to them, and then it will put them back to roaming around for you automatically when you stop talking to him. With the script editor, you need to script that behavior, okay? So in order to do that, you edit your dialogue script, and at the very top, before any dialogue takes place, you want to type self.behavior move area equals none, and that will keep them locked in place. And at the very end of your dialogue, so this is something you would put right at the end, you undo that. So you have self behavior move area equals all. Okay, so the moment you run this script, it locks them in place, and then you go through your dialogue, and then no matter which one you choose, because this always happens at the end, because it's not inside a condition, again, benefit of having an end node or an end path, we can then, at the end of our dialogue, no matter which choice we make, at the very end of the whole dialogue, we set the move area back to roaming around. Now, because we're using execute script, we also want to make sure that because this is the end of a path, we don't want this to trigger until this script has finished. So this is where we would absolutely pause this script so that this doesn't run until this dialog's finished. And likewise, same down here. Because we've got dialogue that's happening in a separate script file, we want to make sure all of that gets triggered before this then plays and starts moving around. Otherwise, when we execute this script and we do the dialogue that's inside this file, they'll then start walking around for that. So make sure you use true to pause this script so this can't run until that dialogue is finished as well. But that's how, it's very simple, just at the beginning and the end, you just bookmark your entire dialogue with a pause and then a move behavior request for that NPC. Okay, so that's going to cover the tips that I wanted to cover in this video for using the script editor as an alternative to the dialogue editor, because there's so much more you can do in the script editor with your dialogues as opposed to the dialogue editor, because the dialogue editor can only do these things here. That's it, that's the limit. Whereas the script editor, you have access to all of these and all of these, right? Oops, all of these. Right? So you can do so much more, and you've got access to while loops and for loops in your dialogues. You can do, there's just so many things you can be so much more creative with what you can achieve with your dialogues when you write them in the script editor, because you've got access to all of the game tools in your dialogues, whereas you don't in the dialogue editor because you've only got access to these nodes here. There's no way of looping, for example. I mean, you might be able to do it with a script node, but it's probably not going to work that well. Whereas you can absolutely have looping dialogue if you need it. Don't know why, but you could. Anyway, so it's a bit more advanced to go into that. So I'm not going to cover it as a tip in this video, but I just wanted to mention it because you should be aware of it. Once you've written dialogues in the script editor, you have access to all of these tools. So your dialogues can make use of these tools as well. So you can be very creative with how your dialogues actually function if you use the script editor. But anyway, so that will wrap up this video on the tips that you should be aware of when using the script editor as an alternative to the dialogue editor. But I do thoroughly recommend using the script editor as an alternative because although it's a bit more, it might on the surface seem a bit more long-winded, a bit more complicated because you have to know the code and all of that. If you can get your head around it, it's so much more flexible and so much more user-friendly. You're going to have less headaches, honestly, using the script editor than you are with the dialogue editor. Because although you may have to sort of look up a few things about how to do this in the script editor, that looking up something is much better than restarting your whole dialogue over again because you forgot to put a node in place and you can't add it in later. So, you decide which one you'd rather use and which one you'd sacrifice, but, I would personally advocate the script editor. But what I would say is if you're starting out and you've never used the dialogue editor before, I would at least start using it first so you get used to how it works and also get used to scripting first before you fully commit to writing dialogues in the script editor, because obviously it does require you to be knowledgeable of these things. You'll have a much easier time writing dialogues in the script editor if you know how to use the script editor, right? And the script. But I've pointed you in this video to all the nodes and how to do go-to nodes and stuff like that. So you should be set up to write dialogues. Dialogue scripts are very easy to write because they're literally just the dialogue nodes and some condition nodes. And if you need to use go-to nodes, either use a function or a separate script. So you should be well covered in this video for, writing dialogue scripts. They're actually the easiest script to write, in my opinion, because it's just a load of display message nodes and display choices nodes wired up in the path that you want them to go down. So they're actually very easy to do. But with that said, that'll wrap up this video. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next tutorial.